tide. Ambition comes with a cost, and soon, Japan would challenge a power greater than itself. Two. The road harbor tensions escalate Japan's expansion of Western interests in the Pacific. The United States, seeking to halt its advance, imposed oil trade embargoes, cutting off the blood of Japan's military machine. Diplomats exchanged words of peace. Behind the scenes, war plans already in motion. Japan faced a choice: surrender its ambition before the noose tightened. Its leaders chose the latter. In total secrecy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto developed a plan to cripple a Pacific fleet in one decisive blow. The target: Pearl Harbor. Chapter 3. 7th, 1941, a date which will for me. Morning of December 7th, 41, just 8 a.m., the Sea of Pearl Harbor erupted. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft descended the unsuspecting base. Minutes, battleship engulfed in flames, airfields destroyed, 2,000 American lost. It was one of the most deadly attacks in modern. Yet, amidst the chaos, a nation began to harden. Next day, President D. Roosevelt addressed, declaring that the United States was now at war. The giant had awakened. Chapter 4. Pacific ignites. The followed saw Japan at the high power. Victory after another from the to Singapore. The map red with imperials, but vast industrial now in motion. Floods, facts, and airfield roared to life. Tanks, aircraft, ships at unprecedented speed. Across the Pacific, an island-hopping war had brutal struggle fought over ocean, jungles, and skies. For both sides, it would become a test of courage and sacrifice. The attack on Pearl Harbor meant to break America's spirit. Instead, it was unity that would change the course of the war and that it followed. Of that morning, a superpower would emerge, and the Pacific, distant and quiet, become the stage for some of history's first battles. Was the War of the Pacific. Scrolled turned Midway Stalingrad. How fought world marked the beginning for the powers. World War II changed. 1942, Axis power at their peak. Across Europe, Hitler stretched from the to the edges of Russia. Across the Pacific, Japan's dominated oceans seemed unstoppable and order rising from conquest fear, but he turned two places, thousands apart. For 4 defining chapters from the frozen streets of Stalingrad, sunlit waves of Midway battle changed not just the war, but the destiny of nations. Chapter 1. The Siege of Stalingrad. Campbell. In the 1742, he launched his most ambitious campaign, yet Operation had failed the Soviet Union. He aimed for its heart. Stalingrad, a city that bore Stalin's name, became of pride and defiance. As German forces through the streets, Soviet resistance stiffened. The battle was brutal, house to house, to room, intent froze the dead where they fell. Civilians were trapped in the ruins. Soldiers fought over an inch of ground. It was not just a battle for a city, it was a battle for the soul of a nation. Chapter: The Soviet Strike. Then, in November 1942, the Red Army struck back. Using deception and precision, they encircled the German 6th Army, trapping hundreds of thousands of men in the frozen ruins. As winter deepened, food and ammunition ran out. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground. Surrender was forbidden. But the Russian winter and Soviet determination proved stronger than orders. By February 1943, what remained of the 6th Army surrendered. It was Germany's first major defeat and a turning point in the war. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered in the snows of Stalingrad. Chapter 3. Across the ocean. The Battle of Midway. While Stalingrad raged in Europe, another decisive battle was unfolding thousands of miles away on the waves of the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan had sought to destroy the American Navy once and for all. In June 1942, their fleet moved toward a tiny atoll called Midway, unaware that their secret codes had been broken. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his American fleet lay in wait. When Japan's carriers launched their attack, U.S. aircraft struck back with devastating precision, sinking 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted in hours. Midway proved that intelligence, courage, and timing could defeat each strongest of forces. Chapter 4. The World Turns. Stalingrad and Midway, 2 battles, fought on opposite ends of the world, but bound by one truth. The tide of war had turned. Germany's armies began to retreat. Japan's empire began to crumble. For the first time, victory seemed possible for the Allies. The Axis still held vast territories, and years of bloodshed lay ahead, but the momentum of history had shifted. In the factories of America, the fields of Russia, and the hearts of millions, hope began to rise again. From the frozen ruins of Stalingrad to the endless seas of Midway, the world had witnessed the turning of the tide. The cost was unimaginable, but through sacrifice and resilience, the Allies began to push back against tyranny. The tide of war had turned, and soon, the world itself would begin to change. Subscribe for Episode 5, D-Day, the invasion of Europe. How the Allies crossed the English Channel and began the final march toward victory. World War II series, the war that changed everything before the Cold War, before the nuclear age. There was a fire that reshaped the entire world. A war fought not just with weapons, but with ideas, ambition, and vengeance. Episode 1, The Spark. How World War II began, before the Cold War, before the nuclear age. There was a fire that reshaped the entire world. A war fought not just with weapons, but with ideas, ambition, and vengeance. This is the story of how it began, how peace turned to chaos, and how the world's greatest tragedy was set in motion. Explore 4 defining chapters that reveal how one man's ambition and the world's hesitation lit the spark for a global war. 1. The aftermath of the Great War. The Great War was supposed to end all wars, but in its ashes, a darker storm began to form. The year was 1919. The Treaty of Versailles had been signed, and with it came both peace and humiliation. Germany was forced to pay, to surrender, to bow. An empire reduced to rubble, its people left hungry and humiliated. But history has shown resentment is a seed that grows in silence. 2. The rise of a new power. In 1933, a man named Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising strength, unity, and revenge. To a desperate nation, his words sounded like hope. To the rest of the world, they sounded like echoes from a nightmare. He rebuilt Germany's pride and its armies. As factories roared to life and tanks rolled across fields, the world watched, uncertain, unwilling to believe what was coming. 3. The world watchers and waits Europe watched uneasily as Germany rearmed in defiance of the treaty. The League of Nations, built to preserve peace, stood powerless. When Hitler marched into the Rhineland in 1936, there was outrage, but no action. When Austria fell in 1938, silence again. At Munich, leaders smiled for cameras as they signed yet another promise of peace. But peace built on fear is never meant to last. 4. The spark ignites. On September 1st, 1939, the silence ended. Germany invaded Poland. It was swift, it was brutal, and it was unstoppable. Within weeks, Polish resistance was crushed beneath the weight of Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world was once again at war, a war more terrible than anyone could imagine. The spark had become an inferno. Within months, the world would be drawn into a conflict that touched every continent, every ocean, and every life. This was the beginning of World War II, the war that changed everything. Subscribe for Episode 2, The Fall of Europe, how a continent collapsed under the weight of Blitzkrieg, and how courage took to the skies. World War II, the war that changed everything, Episode 2, The Fall of Europe. The war had begun, but Europe was about to face a storm unlike any it had ever seen. In just months, nations that had once dominated the world were reduced to rubble. Armies fell, cities burned, and millions of lives were uprooted. From the frozen plains of Poland to the streets of Paris, the speed and ferocity of Germany's attacks stunned the world. In this episode, we explore 4 defining chapters, moments that show how Europe collapsed under a force of lightning-fast armies, and how courage and resistance began to shine even in the darkest hours. 1. Blitzkrieg. Lightning War strikes. Germany's strategy was terrifyingly simple and devastatingly effective. They called it Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Speed, surprise, and overwhelming coordination allowed German forces to shatter defensive lines before armies could react. Poland fell within weeks. Cities were occupied, railways and communication lines seized, and civilians fled in panic. Belgium and the Netherlands followed, their armies overwhelmed by mechanized units and relentless strikes. Europe's military, still recovering from the First World War, were unprepared for this new kind of warfare. Blitzkrieg was not just a military tactic, it was a demonstration of absolute psychological dominance. It showed the world that a war could be won not just with numbers, but with precision, coordination, and fear. 2. France. By June 1940, France, a nation long considered the heart of European power, had surrendered. Paris fell without a fight. Museums, streets, and squares, once bustling with life, were now under occupation. The fall of France sent shockwaves across the world. For Britain, it was more than a loss of a continental ally, it was a stark warning. Alone on an island, Britain faced Hitler's war machine, and the threat of invasion loomed large. Yet even in despair, small acts of courage emerged. French soldiers and citizens organized resistance cells, laying the groundwork for the movements that would haunt the occupiers for years to come. 3. The Battle of Britain. Courage in the skies. The skies over England became a battlefield. The Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombers, intending to crush morale and pave the way for invasion. But the Royal Air Force refused to yield. Radar technology, ingenuity, and the relentless courage of pilots and ground crews allowed Britain to withstand the onslaught. This was the first major Allied victory of the war, proof that even against a seemingly unstoppable force, determination and strategy could prevail. The Battle of Britain became a symbol of resilience, a shining moment when ordinary people faced extraordinary danger and refused to surrender. 4. The Eastern threat looms. The Soviet Union, scarred from past wars and political upheavals, fortified its borders, aware that Hitler's ambitions would eventually reach its lands. By 1941, plans were being made for a massive invasion that would shake the world and open the Eastern Front, a front that would become the largest and bloodiest theater of war in history. Europe was falling, but the war was far from over. Across the continent, resistance movements began to organize, nations began to prepare, and the stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the entire world. In less than a year, the landscape of Europe had changed forever. Nations fell, cities burned, millions of lives were shattered. The fall of Europe was swift, and it set the stage for battles that would decide the fate of the world. From the ashes of surrender and occupation, courage and resistance would emerge. But the war was only beginning. This was the fall of Europe. Subscribe for episode 3, Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Awakens. How a quiet setting turned into a conflict, pulling the United States into the war. World War II, the war that changed everything. Episode 3, Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Awakens. For years, the fires of war burned across Europe. But far away, across the Pacific, another storm was quietly gathering. The United States watched the chaos from a distance, a sleeping giant, rich in industry and power, but reluctant to fight another foreign war. Yet, on a quiet Sunday morning, everything changed. This is the story of how the war leapt across oceans, and how one attack awakened a force that would reshape the world. Explore 4 defining chapters from Japan's rising ambitions to America's shocking entry into World War II. Chapter 1, Rising Sun. Japan's imperial ambition. The roots of the Pacific War reach back long before Pearl Harbor. In the 1930s, Japan sought to become the dominant power in Asia. Fueled by nationalism, scarcity of resources, and a vision of destiny, Japan expanded aggressively first into Manchuria in 1931, then into China in 1937. While the world condemned these invasions, few intervened. The Great Depression had weakened Western nations, and isolationist sentiment ran strong in the United States. Japan's empire grew unchecked, stretching across the Pacific like a rising tide. But ambition comes with a cost, and soon challenge a power far greater than itself. Chapter 2. The road to Pearl Harbor tensions escalated as Japan's expansion threatened Western interests in the Pacific. The United States, seeking to halt Japan's advance, imposed oil and trade embargoes, cutting off the lifeblood of Japan's military machine. Diplomats exchanged words of peace, but behind the scenes, war plans were already in motion. Japan faced a choice: render its ambitions or strike before the new tightened. Its leaders chose the latter. And over 2,000 American lives lost. It was one of the most devastating surprise attacks in modern history. Yet, amidst the smoke and chaos, a nation began to harden. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation, declaring that the United States was now at war. The sleeping giant awakened. Chapter 4. The Pacific ignites. The months that followed saw Japan at the height of its power. One victory after another, from the Philippines to Singapore, painted the map red with imperial flags. But a vast industrial strength in motion. Shipyards, factories, and airfields roared to life, using tanks, aircraft, and ships at unprecedented speed. Across the Pacific, an island-hopping war had begun, a brutal, relentless struggle fought over oceans, jungles, and skies. For both sides, it would become a test of endurance, courage, and sacrifice. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to break America's spirit. Instead, it forged a unity that would help change the course of the war and the century that followed. From the ashes of that morning, a global superpower would emerge, and the Pacific, once distant and quiet, would become the stage for some of history's fiercest battles. This was the awakening of the Pacific. Subscribe for episode 4, Turning the Tide, Midway and Sad. How two battles fought worlds apart marked the beginning for the Axis. World War II, the war that changed everything. Episode 4, Turn the Tide. Mid-1942, the Axis powers had